All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective, and that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure-to-pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity, but to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy, or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
The more you can understand their way of thinking and serve as that proxy, the more successful you'll be. But some CEOs are just not comfortable. They own their work, they want to do their work, and they want to separate it. You take this, I take this. It's just not going to work. And so that bonus that I mentioned of really kind of stepping in for the CEO, being that trusted partner, being able to push back, it's only going to happen if the CEO is willing to let go a little bit and trust you and let you in. That's going to be really important for both of you.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
All right, everyone, my guest today is Dan Soleimani. Prior to joining Aspire Public Schools as the Chief of Staff, Dan built and led the school management office for Success Academy Charter Schools in New York. In that specific role, he led a team of 25 individuals to scale school supports effectively and efficiently during the organization's rapid growth to 45 campuses. Additionally, he supported superintendents and school teams with data reporting and analytics, enrollment matters, policy development, special education, crisis management, and conflict resolution. Prior to heading up the school management office, Dan served as the Assistant General Counsel and Chief of Staff to Success Academy's Chief Legal Officer for over 5 years. Prior to entering the charter school space, Dan worked in the juvenile rights practice for the Legal Aid Society, representing youth in juvenile justice and child protection matters. Dan does this work because he believes that education is the most effective lever for achieving personal and societal progress. Both of Dan's parents are Jewish Iranian refugees who fled to the U.S. in 1979, just prior to the Iranian Revolution. He's keenly aware of the opportunities that were afforded him and his family by accessing high-quality public education and is committed to ensuring access and opportunity to underserved communities. Dan is a proud graduate of UCLA and Georgetown, where he earned his law degree, and he lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife and their 2 young children, ages 3 and 4, and their mini golden doodle, not to be forgotten. In today's conversation, Dan and I dissect the life of the Chief of Staff of a large CMO operating multiple campuses all across the state of California and navigating all of the complexity that comes with that job. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Dan, what is a Chief of Staff? I feel like Chief of Staff is one of those cool titles that nobody actually really knows what they do. So what's a Chief of Staff? Let's dive right in.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. I just want to thank you, Daniel, for allowing me on the show. Super excited to be here. What a great topic and a great idea to bring folks together talking about charter schools. But yeah, let me dive in. So I'd say in general, it varies depending on the needs of the CEO and the stage that the organization is in. But I'd put it in sort of 4 buckets, and then there's kind of a bonus. So the first and most important, to my mind, is providing direct support to the CEO. So the Chief of Staff takes on key responsibilities, generally the responsibilities the CEO has. So things like setting and monitoring strategic priorities, screening opportunities, standing in for the CEO, and emails, meetings, calls, etc., preparing for and facilitating key meetings. So a lot of the responsibilities the CEO has, the Chief of Staff can take on for them and free them up. The second is providing strategic planning and organizational alignment. So the Chief of Staff should lead the strategic planning process and partner with the leadership team to execute on it and progress monitor it. They also just make sure that you've done some resource mapping so you can actually execute on the plan. So you got to make sure you have the right staffing to commit. And then there's special projects. Every organization has them. Chief of Staffs are really good at bringing together cross-functional teams where there's no clear owner. You've got to coordinate some decision-making and crisis management situations. And then lastly, they're sort of the glue that keeps the team together. So aside from the CEO, the chief of staff is typically the only person in the organization who has a bird's eye view of the entire enterprise, all of the functions. And they can really help make sure all the leaders and all of your team are rowing in the same direction. So I mentioned there's 4 buckets. The one bonus I would bring up is if you have the right relationship, the right partnership, the right chief of staff, they can be a trusted confidant for you as a CEO. Being a CEO is super hard. It's stressful, can be lonely sometimes. So by definition, everyone reports to you and you don't really have any peers, at least internally. So who do you go to for the hard decisions when you're torn and everyone is coming at you with a different perspective? Who can feel comfortable pushing back on you and bringing up different perspectives? Who can you share frustrations with, vent to, etc.? A chief of staff can really do all those things and build that relationship.
Makes sense. I'm really excited to dig into this more. And I think the 4 buckets plus the bonus are helpful framing for the conversation. I want to provide a little bit more background to yourself. So when I hear everything you just described, the first thing that jumps to mind is 1, what a really fun role, but 2, this requires a unique toolbox of skills. So can you share a little bit about how you came into this role at Aspire? And then additionally, what were some of your previous roles that kind of have lended themselves to this chief of staff role that kind of prepared you to step into a job that is, truly cross-functional?
Yeah, so I started doing juvenile justice work, which is basically criminal defense for minors. So that's why I went to law school initially. I knew I wanted to work with kids. I knew I wanted to do legal work, and that is sort of the overlap that I saw. And I went to Georgetown Law. They had a great clinic where you could get in-court experience. That's kind of what they were known for. So I did a juvenile justice clinic. I had this experience where I had a client who had done something wrong, and I was representing him. He was being detained, and as a defense lawyer, the first thing to tell you is get your client out, get your client out, get your client out. Everybody wants to go home, right? So that's what I did. I got him out. I was super proud of myself, and he was really pissed at me. Yeah, and he was angry. And basically what he said is, I'm a lot safer where I'm at in detention, and I'm getting a better education than I was at my school. And I feel cared for here. I've got a bed, I've got food. And I was just stunned.
Wow.
And I kind of wanted to see what he was talking about. So I said, well, let me come visit you at school. And I went, and I was just shook. I was very privileged with the education that I had. And when I saw his school, it just kind of rocked my world, because I thought I was dedicating myself to something that was really important, and it is super important. But the challenge I had was kind of what comes next. So even if I win this case, even if he's not convicted of these charges, he's going to go back to the same school and the same community. And what future does that mean he has? And so I kind of said, well, I got to pivot. That work's really important, but it's just not for me. And so I started looking around, and I found a charter network in New York that was looking for in-house counsel. And I said, well, that's pretty cool. I mean, I could continue working for kids. I didn't really know what a charter school was, but it let me do all those things. And so I took on that role and sort of worked my way up and helped them grow from 9 schools to they're now over 50 schools throughout New York City with tens of thousands of kids. And then from there, we moved west. Just couldn't really live the New York lifestyle anymore with little kids, and found Aspire was looking for a chief of staff, and it let me continue to build out those skill sets. So that's how I got here.
And I would imagine the growing from 9 schools to 50 plus in New York City is a unique growth trajectory to be a part of that probably gave you experiences to understand some of the challenge points that come up within scaling a large organization. In terms of Aspire, so you alluded to some of your experiences that lended well to being a chief of staff. Can you share a little bit about the size and scale of Aspire today? Because I think it helps frame the conversation for digging more into the role itself and some of the things you're working on today. Because the chief of staff role, as you alluded to, can obviously take on a lot of different forms, but depending on the size and scale of the organization, the projects you're working on probably vary. So can you speak a little bit to kind of where Aspire's at, maybe when you joined 4 years ago and where you guys are at today?
Yeah, sure. So it's currently at 36 schools, about 15,300 students. What makes Aspire unique is that it's in 3 different regions. So whereas my old organization, Success Academy, was only in New York, Aspire is in the Central Valley, where we have 16 schools. We have 11 in Los Angeles and 9 in the Bay Area. We used to have schools in Tennessee, but we spun those off. And if you know anything about California, you know those three regions might as well be different states. The Central Valley is very different than LA. Even LA is very different than the Bay. And so there's just differences in terms of culture, politics, and demographics. But what that also means is that we're in 8 different counties and we have 10 different authorizers. And so even having your own authorizers, your own counties, we saw during COVID, which the different mask mandates and vaccine mandates, it just adds a level of complexity that I hadn't experienced before. And so that's kind of a unique part of Aspire. I don't think there are any other CMOs in California that are statewide. There are CMOs that have different 501c3s that operate in each region, but not like us that operate all 3 regions.
So let's talk more about this chief of staff role. So you've been in the position now with Aspire for 4+ years. What was the original vision that was painted for you when you were hired? Because you mentioned the move from New York to California. I don't know if you were in a chief of staff role when you left Success Academy or when you were looking for a new role, if you found the chief of staff role and thought, ooh, I have this interesting mix of experiences. Talk to us a little bit about what that role was originally supposed to be when you were interviewing for it, kind of what your expectations were.
So when I was at Success Academy, I mentioned I joined as a in-house counsel. That team grew, and then I eventually became assistant general counsel and chief of staff for the legal team, which oversaw policy and advocacy work too. The gap that I had though was I had never taught, I never worked in a school. I wasn't a superintendent or a principal manager or principal. And so as much as I understood about schooling from the legal side of the house, I didn't really know what it took to operate a school or do the instruction. And I wanted that experience. And so our CEO came to me and offered me the opportunity to open a new office called the School Management Office at Success Academy, which was pretty unique and very innovative. Essentially, what we did is the school strategy and management. So establishing a lot of systems and processes, our report cards, our academic calendar, how do we push out deliverables to our principals and to our leaders, our re-enrollment process, our elementary to middle school to high school tracking process, data systems, all of that stuff. And so even though it wasn't a chief of staff role, it was very interdisciplinary. We also oversaw SPED, student support, and data, and did things like leader bonuses and other things, academic results. And so that gave me a good holistic view, but I also had the legal side. So when I came to Aspire, I kind of had 3 objectives. The first one was to break down some of the silos between the functional departments and improve our communication, mostly with our staff, but also with families and with students. A lot of our comms were reactive. So some situation would happen, some crisis would happen, we would push out comms, but we weren't really getting our story out there, even with our own people. Talking about, Aspire had been around for over 20 years at that point, it's now 25 years, talking about our legacy. What are the cool, innovative things that we've done? How are we thinking about instruction differently? How are we engaging our staff to get their input and feedback? We just really needed to get Aspire's brand and story out there. The second was I needed to work with the team to identify goals and metrics. So both to assess our growth and also how we were allocating resources to schools in a more equitable way based on need. So we didn't really have a set of metrics. We didn't know how those should be set. Should they be set by region? Should they be set by school? Or are they at the org level? What's the length? And how are we measuring growth? And what are the absolute measures we're looking at? And then last, we were looking at our organizational structure. So as I mentioned, we have the 3 regions, but they're all under one 501c3. And what that meant is we had a lot of confusion around decision-making rights. So who gets to decide the strategy? Is that the central office sitting out of Oakland, or does each region get to do that? Who gets to decide which curriculum we're going to use? Who gets to decide pedagogy, how to allocate resources? And we were kind of in this gray area. So the central office made some of the decisions. Some of them were delegated to the regions. But no one was super clear. People weren't clear on their roles. Am I recommending this? Am I telling the regions and the schools they have to do that? And then if you're a region or school, do I have to do that? Is that a recommendation? Can I do something different? And so we said, okay, we've got to go one way or the other. We can't stay in this gray area where people are kind of confused in terms of who makes decisions. And so I worked with my CEO, and in January 2020, we went to our leaders and announced that we were going to become more centralized. And we had done a lot of benchmarking, a lot of engagement. We created some org structures, and that's where we landed. And then 2 months later, the pandemic hit and pretty much changed everything.
Yeah, that kind of best laid plans, right? Opportune timing to wrap up that project. COVID obviously is its own whole environment to navigate school in, and I would imagine tons and tons of pivots, working off of real-time data. I want to stay on this thread, though, of the chief of staff role itself. So in terms of, you alluded that one of your first goals was breaking down silos. I'm curious, from your perspective, having sat in the role, what are some signs for an organization that maybe it's time to hire a chief of staff? Because one of the things you mentioned at the top of our conversation was the chief of staff, outside of maybe the CEO, is really that one other person who's looking at things from a bird's eye view. How does an organization know that it's time to hire a chief of staff? Like, did Aspire have a chief of staff before you? Was this a newly created position? I guess I'm just curious for organizations that might be listening to this conversation and thinking, wow, we have all sorts of those similar challenges that Dan just laid out for his 3 goals coming into the organization. Maybe we should have a chief of staff, like what comes to mind for evaluating whether that role should exist and whether it's a good fit?
Yeah. So, to answer part of your question, Aspire did have a chief of staff before I joined, and it was actually our current CEO. She was the chief of staff she was the chief of staff for a while. The former CEO left. She took on the interim CEO role and then became permanent, and knew the value of a chief of staff because she had done it and she knew how important it was. And so that was one of the first hires she wanted to make, which has actually been great for me because she understands the ins and outs and is able to really guide and support me. So that's kind of a unique situation. But in general, there's no magic ratio where no one's going to send you an email, hey, it's time to hire a chief of staff.
Right.
But there's some things to kind of look at. So some factors I would raise are you growing from a small or medium organization to a large organization? So is your complexity increasing? Because as you pivot out of a startup mode, which a lot of charter schools say, we're a startup. But as you expand, the work tends to really silo. So the teams just get bigger, and some of those threads between the different roles go away. And so that's when you can say, hey, we're getting really complex. We really need somebody who can help bridge some of the gaps between our functions. That's one. 2, if you're a CEO, and other roles have chiefs of staff too. The CFO can have one, a CTO, a chief people officer can have one. But if we're talking about a CEO, if the CEO feels really strapped for capacity and says, I never have time for deep strategic thinking, which is one of the top responsibilities of a CEO, that may be a good sign you need a chief of staff. Because that chief of staff, I mentioned one of the buckets, they can take on a lot of the functions that the CEO is doing. They should be able to. They're not a glorified executive assistant. They're not someone who does scheduling and calendaring. They really are someone who can take on some of the functions for the CEO, especially the complex ones. So if you could essentially clone yourself and create another CEO, that's what the chief of staff would be, and they could take on a lot of your responsibilities. A third one might be if you're getting lost in the day-to-day. So no one's looking at your strategic plans. No one's monitoring them. You created them, you put them on the shelf. And this has been my experience in many places I've been. Everyone says, okay, strategic planning, let me put all my goals, and we're never going to talk about them. No one's ever going to look at it. No one's ever going to ask me about it. That's a problem, right? So you invest a lot of time and energy. But if the days and the months are just flying by, which they can in schooling, and it doesn't feel like you're being intentional about how you're approaching the work, that may be a sign you need a chief of staff. And then the last one I would mention, actually there are 2. If your leadership team is not operating at its highest potential. So if teams are doing something and one of your other C-suite people says, what? I didn't know that was happening. No one looped me in. Oh my God, now I got to go to my team and we've got this fire drill and I've got to loop people in because we didn't know about the comms or we didn't know about the implications. If that's happening, or there are projects happening and your other team members don't know, they're not aware, and they say, hey, if I knew that, that's really great. We could have publicized that or done something with it or talked about the financial implications. But if you don't really have that glue currently and there isn't a clear home for that, that would be a good time to get a chief of staff. And then lastly, I would say, if you're often sitting in your meetings, you're discussing projects and it says, oh, this actually touches on finance. No, it actually touches technology. No, it touches on comms. And then you all look at each other and go, who should own this? And no one has an answer.
Right.
It probably means you need a chief of staff. It's typically how I get most of my projects is it touches on every function. It's like, well, it's not really the CFO and it's not really the COO, but there's no role that can kind of take that on. Well, that's what a chief of staff would do.
Really helpful frameworks for thinking about how and when to consider a chief of staff. And the project hot potato you mentioned at the end, I feel like is so common, where everyone agrees this needs to get done and then there's no ownership of it. And what ends up happening is either it doesn't get done, or you have to pay an outside consultant to do it, or you're doing pieces of the project in different departments. So I think probably a lot of people can relate to that one. So In terms of the day-to-day, because I think you did a nice job of laying out when an organization should think about bringing in this person and elevating that this really is a strategic role to kind of mimic or mirror what the CEO is doing to free up time for the CEO, provide the cross-functional executive. What does the day-to-day actually look like? Because I'm sure people are wondering, okay, Dan, I understand the thinking behind hiring this role. What does it actually look like? If we followed you with a camera for a day or a week, or if you vlogged your life or something like that, what would we actually see kind of on a typical week in terms of things that you're engaged in?
Yeah, so I mean, this is my favorite part of the job, but it's honestly sometimes the most challenging is it changes a lot. I would say, first of all, it's a lot of meetings. It's not unique, I don't think, to Aspire. We just really love meetings in public education.
Yep.
Part of my job is to make sure we don't have as many. So we try to think creatively about how to split them up and do tactical and strategic and all that. But quite a few meetings, but that's kind of how you serve as the glue, is by bringing people together and build those bridges. I do try to split my work up between strategic, tactical, and just knocking out emails. It's sometimes hard to do with all the different meetings and calls that are scheduled. So you really got to build that time in for deep thinking, because it just will never get done. But pretty much every day I'm doing some form of preparation for a meeting coming up. Could be a board meeting, one of our board committees, a leadership team meeting, a principal meeting, a leader convening, a retreat, strategy meetings, just a whole variety of meetings that happen. And they all are built into our scope and sequence so that we are backwards mapping from decisions that need to be made or implemented. It does require a lot of making PowerPoint presentations, meeting with other folks, pulling in their content, tagging people, making sure all the pieces come together. And then there is a fair amount of logistics involved for some of these, like getting venues and food and AV, especially for our big retreats and our leadership meetings. I do quite a few check-ins with our functional leaders across the org. I'm asking what's top of mind for them. What challenges are they experiencing? Where are the gaps? Is their work stalled? Is there something they need from our CEO that either I can bring to her, or answer for them? And so I'm trying to kind of proactively manage some of these problems before they explode or catch on fire. I'm checking in on my projects. So I have deliverables I've got to get out, deadlines, uploading pre-reads for the board, or preparing presentations. There are some crises we have, especially during COVID. There's a lot of kind of new regulation came out, or a new announcement was made, and we had to jump into action and figure out how to respond. Obviously in schooling, there's a lot of school crises that happen, safety and weather and all that. So we've got to respond often. I do a lot of thought partnership. I might meet with one of our teams and say, hey, this is how I think the HR team might think about that. Or have you thought about the technology implications and the systems implications? Have you made sure there's a budget? Do you know where that budget's coming from and who's paying for it? So I try to step in the shoes of other teams. And even if I'm just CC'd on something, I'll kind of bring that lens to it. I mentioned the scope and sequence. That's a big one, making sure we're being intentional about meetings. And then a lot of communications. So reviewing our memo that our CEO sends to our organization, looking at some of the newsletters that our region send, and then seeing where I can be helpful to our CEO. So there are emails I can draft on her behalf. I'll reach out and ask her, are there calls I can take? Are there things I can tell her, look, you don't need to join that meeting. I'll take it and kind of loop you in. So it's kind of a mix, but that's kind of the exciting and fun part of the job, is it varies so much.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it requires a diverse skill set, and it definitely seems fast-paced. What do you find to be the biggest challenges of the role? And maybe these have changed maybe since like your first year versus now. What are some of the things that, as you reflect on the difficulties in the job, are there themes of challenges that arise as you're kind of wrangling multiple departments and trying to keep huge strategic projects moving forward? Are there consistent things that you would flag for any future chief of staff? These are probably going to be challenges you will run into.
Yeah, for sure. There's probably three. I mean, the flip side of having a big plate and doing a lot of different things is that it's sometimes challenging because there's no guardrails in terms of what your role is or what you're expected to do. You don't own an area, right? So it's not like I handle accounting or I handle finance or I handle talent recruitment. You kind of are across the board, which is fun and exciting, but it's easier for people to say, oh, that's the chief of staff and that's a chief of staff and that's a chief of staff. And before you know it, you've got this massive plate. And so there's got to be some kind of barriers or boundaries that you can set. And it doesn't mean you're not supporting, but you're probably not owning it. Another one I would say is there's not a lot of repeats in terms of the issues that come to you, which again is exciting and fun and interesting, but at the same time, it's kind of it really can push your cognitive lift and force you to be really creative. You can't just dust something off and say, oh, this is how we've always done it, because it's usually a really complex cross-functional problem that you haven't really seen before. You don't really know how to tackle it. And so there's not a lot of repetition, and the days can get kind of exhausting, to be honest, with all the new challenges coming at you. And then the last one I would say, and this is a little bit less technical, but you've got to think about where your quote unquote, your power comes from, right? So you've got to make sure you've got really strong relationships. Some chiefs of staff have direct reports, many don't. And so you could use your positional power and say, I'm the CEO's chief of staff and you must do X, Y, Z. That's going to run short really quick. People are going to resent you pretty fast. They're going to do it, but they're not, or they may not do it. But if they do it, they're going to talk about you behind your back and talk about how you don't have relationships. You're just using your positional power to make changes and make decisions. And who have you engaged? So you've really got to invest in the relationships. Why should people believe you? Why should people do the things you're asking them to do? What data do you have? What engagement have you done? What expertise do you have? What trust have you built? So you're not doing it because you manage all these folks. You're doing it because there's some special role you play where you're able to do all these things. You're able to go and build these connections and figure out where the overlaps are. And as that happens, people will see the value. But I think originally people are kind of like, what's a chief of staff? What do you really own? Like, you're just kind of the CEO's proxy in some way. And I'd rather just talk to them. Why should I work through you? So that will often happen too.
Yeah, I can totally see that, especially I would imagine in that first year where, like you said, relationships are critical, but building relationships takes time. And so maybe in those early months, there is that reaction of, who is this person again? Why are they in my meeting?
Yeah, and that's real, especially for people who typically directly report to the CEO, right? When you're small and people are used to their one-to-ones and just getting an answer from the CEO, and now you've added in this layer of, I want you to go to my chief of staff first. And it feels like red tape and people may not like it. And so it's kind of on you to explain to them why this is actually better for them, right? So you can make a lot of decisions on behalf of the CEO if you have the CEO's trust. You can help them plan for their meetings with the CEO, help them make their presentations better, anticipate what questions will come up, think about the cross-functional implications. Like, you're there to serve them too, not just the CEO. You're there to support the entire team. And so it may feel like you're adding an additional step by moving into the chief of staff role, but you've really got to explain to the team why this is making everyone's work better and why it will benefit the entire organization.
If you had to go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice for becoming a chief of staff, I know you were kind of serving in the role at Success, but let's just say brand new chief of staff, if you had to give yourself kind of one learning, having sat in the role now for a number of years, does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, probably two. I talked about the relationships. That's really key. So in a schooling context, you've got to be in schools. You've got to go out to the sites, meet the principals, walk the classrooms, look at their data with them, ask them what their challenges are, what supports what they like to see from the home office, what are their pain points. We've really got to invest in that relationship because they're also going to be honestly pretty skeptical. What is this new role, the central office, or what is this new role that our chief of staff our CEO brought on? How does that benefit me? So you've got to show that you're invested in their success. The other one I would mention is you've really got to push your CEO to give you access. And what I mean by that is you've got to ask to sit in meetings, to sit in phone calls, maybe to sit side by side with them and look at what emails they're responding to have them CC you when they reach out to the board and reach out to external stakeholders. The more you can understand their way of thinking and what they're focused on and what's a priority for them, the better you can serve them. Because ultimately, look, you're not going to be that useful if every answer you give is different than what the CEO would say, right? People are going to get pretty mad and they're just going to skip you because they're going to say, well, I went to Dan and I asked him, he told me this and I implemented it, and then the CEO felt differently. So
Right.
the more you can understand their way of thinking and serve as that proxy, the more successful you'll be. But some CEOs are just not comfortable. They own their work, they want to do their work, and they want to separate it. You take this, I take this. It's just not going to work. And so that bonus that I mentioned of really kind of stepping in for the CEO, being that trusted partner, being able to push back, it's only going to happen if the CEO is willing to let go a little bit and trust you and let you in. That's going to be really important for both of you.
Really good advice. All right. So before we wrap up here, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about a couple of the big projects you have going on right now, because we've talked a lot about how this is a critical role to drive large strategic projects. It's generally something that's cross-functional and takes a project owner who can work with department heads or executives all across the organization. So I had asked you ahead of this call to think about a couple of the large projects you're involved in. And so I just want to talk about two of them quickly and kind of get your insights on how those projects are going and how the chief of staff sits within those projects or drives those forward. So the first one you had brought up was Aspire kind of working through restructuring of the organization, really thinking about resources, decision-making. You actually alluded to this earlier in our conversation about, okay, we're this huge multi-region CMO. Is it the region? Is it the central office? Who does what? How do we think about, budgeting decisions? Can you tell us a little bit about this particular project and maybe starting with the why behind the project? Is this due to environmental factors? Is this part of your larger 5-year strategic plan? Maybe talk us through the impetus for this particular project.
Yeah, so the impetus started before I got to Aspire. So I kind of jumped in partway. And it was really the role clarity piece and decision making. So we really wanted to make sure we were aligning autonomy and decision making with accountability with resources. So it's really hard if all the decision making lives at the central office, but all the accountability falls on the school, right? Because what your school will tell you is, but I don't decide what programs we use, what curriculums we use, or how it's implemented, or how we train people. So it's not really fair for me to be held accountable. If you flip it and all the decision making is held at the schools, but all the accountability is on the central leadership, well, that feels really difficult. And so what we wanted to do is align those three. So it's not fair to ask your schools to be held accountable for outcomes or results if the decision making lives completely on the other side of the state, in our case, right? I mean, they don't know who those folks are and they don't really get a say as much as they should in terms of how those decisions are made. So the idea was we need to align those three. And as I mentioned or hinted at, the original solution was to align them all at the central office. So bring decision making and resource planning centrally. The pandemic hit though, and it totally threw us for a loop. I mean, it made us completely rethink our approach. And that was just because so many decisions had to be made so fast in the pandemic context. And important ones, right? Like literally life or death, which schools to open or close, how long, what does the instructional program look like? Do we do distance learning? Does that iPads or is that Chromebooks or is that worksheets? When do we reopen? When do we bring our kids back? When do we bring our staff back? Do we do small groups or big groups? I mean, and then all the COVID precautions, the physical distancing, mask, temperature checks, vaccines. I mean, just so many questions. But we were making them centrally on behalf of 3 regions. With 36 schools, the data in terms of the positivity rates and the case rates was radically different between the 3. The politics are super different. And it was just honestly kind of slow. And then the kids came back and we realized they had these tremendous, unprecedented needs, not just academically, but mental health, economically in some cases. And so we asked ourselves, well, who's best positioned to make decisions about how to address that? Is it really someone sitting in the central office who's not in the schools, who's not on the ground? Because that's how we had set it up when we decided to move it all central. But it just really kind of made us question that. And we could have said, we already announced the decision. We've already started putting some things in place, but kudos to our CEO and our leadership team and our principals. We said, no, even though we said that's what we're going to do, we've got to shift it. ESSER, the federal funding in response to the pandemic accelerated some of this because it's winding down. I know some of your other guests have talked about that, but we have some really important decisions to make about how resources are spent. And we just don't think the central office should be making those. And so that's been part of the driver too, to move a lot of this decision-making closer to our regions and closer to our schools.
Can you share a little bit about where your role as the chief of staff sits within that ongoing project? So one, where are you at now that we're kind of, I guess, a semester into the first more normal academic year? Where is this ongoing project at? And then for you personally, how do you think about driving this project forward? Are there specific goals that have already been set up that you're helping march the organization towards? Trying to better understand kind of how this sits in your world as one of your big projects.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where we are at now, we haven't arrived, meaning the regionalization work that we're doing, moving the decision-making and resources closer to regions, to our 3 regions in our schools, it's still kind of in progress. It's not perfect, but what we do know is that this aligns to our beliefs that the folks closest to kids should make decisions about how resources are allocated. So we're continuing to examine various functional bodies of work. We moved our talent work recently over to our regional team. So used to report to our home office and now reports to our regional folks. And that work is just ongoing. That's hard, right? So it's hard to ask some of our teammates to sit in a place of uncertainty. But at the same time, the world is constantly shifting around us and we need to make the decisions that are best for kids. And so we try to be as transparent as we can with our folks about the shifts that we anticipate, probably most than most organizations are, to be honest, which arguably is a little bit difficult because people know that change is still happening, but we believe in transparency. And so we continue sharing that. In terms of my role, it's daunting. It's not something you can undo. So if you choose to go in this direction, you're kind of committed. That's where we're at now. Aspire hasn't always been there. We're reminded frequently that the pendulum has swung back and forth. So we've moved regional, we moved central, and then regional and central. People are saying, enough. Let's decide something and let's do it. So my goal is to make sure that happens, to understand all the implications, and to make sure all the different parts are speaking to each other. So how are we communicating about this? What data are we looking at? How are we engaging the board? And then we set some design principles at the very beginning. So this is what we want to achieve. It's why we're doing it. And it's my job to help our CEO and our regional leaders keep ourselves committed to those design principles and make sure that that's what's driving us. I also think about engagement. So how are we looping in our home office staff, and how are we looping in our principals, and how are we doing some benchmarking work to see what other organizations have done? Because they're frankly not all going in the same direction. They're all approaching this differently. And how do we message about it? What's the right messaging to our teachers and to our families and to our students and the staff that are impacted? What does that cascade look like? So it's the decision-making part and making sure that we're making the best decisions aligned with our design principles, and also the rollout, so the external facing.
All right, so I want to ask a really tactical question about that. There's a lot of moving parts to what you just described. What's your cadence like with your CEO on this? You mentioned communication obviously being huge here, to the regional offices, to the frontline leaders, back to the board. Like, how often are you checking in with your CEO on this? And to go even more in the weeds tactically, do you all have like a shared projects board or a running meeting, or do you use Trello or Notion, or how do you keep track of all this? I know that's a really in the weeds question, but I'm sure people are curious.
Yeah. So on the tactical side, we have our lead communications person for Aspire has a project plan that she uses that we meet on probably about once a week. And we look at it together and say, who have we spoken to? What do we tell them? What messaging have they heard? What are we committed to next? Who's the communicator, et cetera? So that's all mapped out. In terms of the plan itself, schools are a little bit unique because we have this academic calendar and this cycle that exists. And so we're kind of bound by it. We know we have to do our peak hiring in the winter, December to February, let's say. We know we get the state budget in January, which includes our increases to our per pupil funding. We know we don't get test scores until late summer, maybe early fall. And so you have to kind of align your project to that, because it wouldn't really work if we showed up in, let's say, the summer and said, hey, guess what? All of talent is moving to the regions and they're going to do the recruiting from now until the fall. That would just really throw people off. And so we had to time that in the right way so that everyone was kind of on the same page, set up our talent team for success, set up our regional folks for success, and set up the candidates for success. And so it does require some backwards mapping and planning, because you got to make sure you give people time to process all these things. In terms of the CEO and myself, we check in at least 2 to 3 times a week on this. We have some pretty long strategic meetings, just the two of us. We have a consultant who's supporting us we meet with. And then we have meetings with some of the functional representatives. So our CFO, our head of communications, our chief operations person, to think about the various pieces. But just the two of us, we spend a pretty decent chunk of time on this, and it's got to be dedicated think time. We try to get together in person. We try to block off 2 to 3 hours. You can't do this in little spurts of 30-minute Zoom meetings. It's just not going to work.
Really fascinating. All right. So you're a chief of staff and you're busy. So I am not going to go into this next project much, but I am curious just for you to share with the audience this second project, which was you identified you're working with the finance and HR teams to implement an ERP solution. ERP projects are kind of notoriously large, and I would imagine the goal here is kind of streamlining things, reducing manual work, that type of thing. Tell us a little bit about this particular project. What was the tipping point maybe as part one of this question, and then part two, how did you all decide, okay, let's actually take this on? Because I know a lot of times it's like, we know we need to do this project, but the change management alone is going to be so painful for us that we should punt this. So yeah, you can take those two questions in either order. Curious just to hear that on this second project, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so Spire's been around for 25 years, our 25th anniversary this year, which is wonderful and a huge blessing, but in some ways it's also a curse because think about technology 25 years ago and the systems that existed, right? It was all done on probably Excel sheets or something. And so what that meant is you had a lot of manual work. And as time went on, people put Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid. So add this software solution, add this new tool. Now we have Google Docs. And what that means is we're in this world of everything is manual. A lot of the work is manual. It's copy and pasting from one spreadsheet to another spreadsheet as it goes from the talent team to the onboarding team to the finance team. It's not only time consuming and tedious, it's also very error prone. And that's no one's fault. It's just if you do a lot of spreadsheet work and you're copying and pasting and working in different documents, you're going to make some mistakes. So we got to the place where we said, this is just not workable. And under the resource constraints that everybody is in, with enrollment being down and federal funds going away, we said, well, how can we be more strategic and intentional about our resources? And so it did really get to the place where we told the team, the team was telling us our work is really time consuming. We're not being as efficient as we can. And unfortunately, the solution is more work, at least in the beginning. And what I mean by that is to do the ERP work well, you need to dedicate significant amounts of time to first doing some discovery. What are your pain points? Where are the processes failing? And then you've got to map out your current process. So if, for example, you're onboarding a new staff member, what does that look like from offer to when they're in your payroll system? All the various steps. The principal says, yes, I want to hire. The offer letter goes out. They accept the offer letter. They accept the terms. They sign up for benefit. Like all that's got to be documented. And it's not going to document itself. So you've got to ask your team to sit down for a few hours and actually explain every single step along the process. But you're doing this to people who have already told you they're busy and they don't have any capacity at any time. And so we had to really explain to them, look, this is going to make your lives better down the road. It's going to make you feel much more fulfilled in your roles. It's going to eliminate a lot of the manual work, but it's going to take a lift. And so kudos to our team. They've been fantastic. Just, heads down, figuring out ways to make it happen, putting in the time and the energy. And they're not going to see the immediate reward. So we do have to, identify our ERP solution and figure out who we're going to go with and design some of the criteria and do the implementation of the training. So it's a little bit far off away, but the manual lift at the beginning is pretty significant. And I think that's what turns people off from it. Not to mention the cost, but they kind of say, we can make it work. We can make it work. And you're sort of that, that frog in the boiling pot of water where you just stay until you get to the place where your folks are leaving because they can't manage anymore with it. And you're going through this churn and you got to ask yourself, what's more expensive? Going through the process and doing the ERP or continuing to churn people and burn them out because they're just constantly spending time copying and pasting from one spreadsheet to another.
Fascinating. All right. Well, Dan, really appreciate you coming on and doing this. Fascinating for me to hear more about what's going on in your world, some of the big projects on the horizon and currently going on at Aspire. If people are curious to learn more about Aspire, is there anywhere you would point them to? Should they just go to the website? And then same question for if they want to connect with you, if they're curious about life as a chief of staff, maybe they just stepped into a chief of staff role or interviewing for one, where can people learn more about you/Aspire?
Yeah, so Aspire is aspirepublicschools.org. We're also on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn. Please do. Love to chat with you. LinkedIn.com/n/Daniel-Soleimani, or you can email me, dansoleimani@gmail.com. There would also, you had asked about lessons I wish I learned and things I wish I knew. There are communities out there for chiefs of staff. So I think people don't necessarily realize that. I certainly did not. But there is one actually in the charter school space for chiefs of staff and chief strategic officers. And it's a fantastic community set up by the former chief of staff out of KIPP Atlanta. And she's brought together about 60 or so. And we get together once a month and do problems of practice and consultancies and share resources. So you've got to find your community. Happy to get you connected with them. Happy to be that community to begin with, because it can be a lonely role sometimes, right? You don't have your own team and you're sort of trying to figure it all out, but you've got to find your people.
Amazing. Awesome. All right, Dan. Well, thanks again for coming on.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.